Alright, you made it. Last chapter that we're going to cover this in this class, Chapter 12, General Principles of Level Design. Last video where you have to hear my voice. Ray! Alright, let's get into it and get her done. So, objectives, blah 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 blah, blah 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 blah. And what is level design? Well, level design is constructing the experience for the player using components from the game designer. Well, what the heck does that mean? Who knows? We all know what level design is. It's designing the level, but not just designing the level, but you're deciding here's the space the player can actually use, and then here's the limitations on the player. Here are the challenges. Here are the rewards of the level. So you're putting all that stuff into your game. And there's so much other stuff to think about. The lighting level, just the lighting of the level can actually, help to pick the mood or set the mood for the game. The story, where there are cutscenes, how does the player know what's going on in that level? How does he know what rewards are in that level? Things like that. All right, key principles: make the early levels of a game tutorial levels. And one of the best games that is a perfect example of this is Super Meat Boy. Basically, in Super Meat Boy, there was no tutorial. The levels the first couple levels showed you everything you could do. Like one of the very first levels, you hit a wall, and you're like, well, what do I do now? And then that's when you finally figured out for yourself how to climb the wall yourself. Or that you could, run and jump even farther, things like that. So if you look in your game folder, I included a video for you that's just about 10 minutes long where they talk about the Super Meat Boy and the level design, and then they show you examples and things like that. So make sure you check that out. There's also a movie on Netflix. It's called Indie Game the Movie, where they actually follow the two guys that made Super Meat Boy, and you can kind of see, like they're through all the work that they did, and then how they actually got their game published, and how well it did, and they talk about the game and stuff. So it's actually a very neat movie. But I digress. So you want to vary the pacing of the level. All levels should not be the same speed. Well, when the player surmounts a challenge that consumes his resources, provide more resources. So if the level made him spend his money or consume a bunch of health potions or things like that, you want to make sure you replenish those. And make sure the player understands, what's the goal of the level? Is it just to get to the other end? Is he supposed to find something? In Mass Effect, every time you landed on a planet, there was a goal for that level. You had to go find something or kill something or do something. Alright, be clear about the risks, the rewards, and the consequences. Make sure the player understands, what are the rewards in that level. Now, there can be hidden rewards, but generally they should know what he's trying to do, what his goal is, and what he's going to get if he completes that goal. He should also know what the consequence is for failing. If he dies, does he lose all of his loot? Does he go back to the beginning of the level? Does he go back to the last save point? Stuff like that. Alright, you want to reward the player for skill, imagination, intelligence, and dedication. And you have to be careful with that, especially this next line. It says, reward in a large way, punish in a small way. Don't forget, we play games for fun. So if you punish someone too harshly and they lose levels or things like that, they lose motivation to play the game. But on the other hand, if the rewards are too lavish, eventually they become way too powerful, and you have to keep increasing more and more powerful, items into the game. All right, spend more resources on the foreground and not just the background. And remember, the purpose of an artificial component is to put up a good fight and then lose. So the player should be able to win. And you have to design the game, again, around that target audience. There are going to be some people that are very good at your game. And for them, it's going to be easy. You don't want to design the game for them because usually they're the top 10%. You want to use the bell curve and go for that top portion, that top 40% that are going to play your game. There are obviously going to be some people that suck at playing your game and can never get through it. That's just, no matter how easy the game is, there's going to be people like that. But if you focus on that segment, you lose the other 70% of your game segment. So you want to design your game around the largest component that you're designing for. So if you're designing a game for 12-year-old girls, you need to have a whole bunch of 12-year-old girls play and then see how they did, see what they liked, what they didn't like, stuff like that. All right, then you want to implement difficulty settings. Again, some people are suck at games, and some people are really, really good, live in their grandma's basement and play games 24/7, and are really good at them. So you want to have multiple difficulty levels in single-player games for these different styles of play. All right, and then different games require different rewards or have different principles. So action games, you want to vary the pace. You want to have some parts that are very frantic, but then you also don't want to make those too long because you'll wear out the player. You want to give him some times to build and reconsolidate. In strategy games, you want to reward planning. If he just throws all of his troops down the middle, you want to crush him. But if he uses a pincer attack, you want to reward him, and he gets victory. All right, role-playing games obviously offer opportunities for character growth, self-expression, titles in the game, things like that. All right, with sports game, verisimilitude is vital, and that just means the realism. The last thing I want is a football game where my quarterback throws the ball and it looks like it's 10 meters too short to the player, and then the player magically just appears with the ball in his hand and that kind of weird stuff. But you get the idea. All right, and vehicle simulation obviously rewards skillful maneuvering. All right, other genres, construction and management simulation. You want to offer interesting variety of initial conditions and goals. Also, obviously, different things for them to do in the game, not just build, but if you've ever played Kerbal Space Program, not only can I make a ship to go to the moon, but I can also do experiments on the moon, and I can mine the moon and do different things. All right, adventure game, make sure you construct challenges that harmonize with their locations in the story. Artificial life game, create many interaction opportunities for the creatures in their environment. So if you've ever played games like Black and White from a long time ago, Spore, a couple games like that, basically you create life and then you interact with them and then you kind of control them. And then a puzzle game obviously gives the player time to think. So layouts, open layouts allow unconstrained movements. Think World of Warcraft, you can pretty much go anywhere on the map almost. They typically correspond to the outdoors, and they're used in war games and role-playing games and things like that. So think Call of Duty, anything like that, where you have a large map and you can pretty much go anywhere on the map. Linear layouts are more like Dragon Age. You have a certain path that you need to follow, and then as you follow the path, certain things happen, and they happen in order. And once you're done with one area, you can only move to the next area, things like that. Alright, then they have parallel layouts and ring layouts, but you get the idea. Network layouts, hub and spoke layouts, and combinations of layouts. Woohoo! Now, obviously, you've got to kind of decide, what type of game you're playing, and then decide from there. Is a combination best? Is a hub and spoke the best? Usually your MMOs, your online games, are hub and spoke. I go to a quest hub, I grab a bunch of quests, then I go out to the spoke and I finish those quests, then I come back to the hub and turn them in, and then they send me to the next hub. Where in games like EVE Online, I have over 5,000 systems I can go to, and there's no reason that I can't go to any of them. Like I can, from day one, the player can go anywhere in the game. Now, obviously, if he goes into dangerous areas, he's going to die, but he could go there if he wanted to. And the player can do anything. He can be a miner. He can be an explorer. He can go and discover wormholes and sell wormhole locations that he finds. He can go look for anomalies. He can fight pirates. He can be a trader. So there's a lot of freedom, and he can take any path that he wants. So again, really, it all depends on what kind of game that you want and what kind of member. What's the emotional response you're trying to get out of your game? So whenever you're designing the game, that's the two things you want to keep in mind. Who am I designing this for? And what do I want them to feel when they play this game? Alright, and then more things. Obviously, lighting. Lighting has a great effect on the game. Obviously, the more light you have, the brighter the mood. The less light you have, the darker the mood. The color palette. If any of you guys ever played Fallout 3, the color palette was really dark. I mean, everything was a dark kind of, pale, nasty, apocalypse kind of color. Whereas if you compare it today to Fallout 4, Fallout 4 has a much brighter color palette. All right, weather and atmosphere. Is it always raining in my game? Because, everybody hates rain. Rain makes us feel sad, miserable, that kind of stuff. Special visual effects. Typically in games we call these particle effects. Music. Music is a huge one, and they discovered that years ago, and that's why nowadays we have these orchestras that play for major motion pictures. Think about Titanic, and they pay the top singers to do these songs for them. Imagine some of the movies like Fast and Furious and Star Wars, without any music. Then there's always ambient audio and special audio effects, the cool sound effects that kind of let us know that things are going to happen. Alright, progression refers to change or growth. What's the progression? If you've ever played Fable, you start young and you kind of grow older as the game progresses. Or your character starts weak and he progresses to being a strong character. So when you're designing progression, you want to think about the game mechanics. What's going to change on his mechanic? Is he always just going to keep firing his gun and have the same 2 attacks? And then experience. How much experience does he need to get to the next level, to progress upwards? What are his ancillary rewards? What extra stuff does he get? How is the difficulty going to increase? What extra actions are going to be available to him? How's the story going to go? And then how's the character going to grow? Are his facial features going to change? Is he going to physically appear older? If you play a game like The Sims, obviously your character gets old and dies, and then it has a baby, and you kind of keep playing the baby. So you might want to include something like that in your game. Alright, pacing refers to the frequency of individual challenges. You don't want challenge, 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 challenge. You want challenge, relax, challenge, relax, that kind of stuff. But the genre of your game is going to affect pacing too. A deathmatch shooter like Call of Duty, you're always going to have a fast pace. You're always running around looking for people. The last thing you want to do is be a camper in the corner. Who wants to do that? Alright, and then typically adventure games have the slowest pace. So you want to vary the pace between fast and slow moments. Every game should have some kind of place where the pace increases at least a little bit. And then as you progress in the game, they tell you that the pacing should become more rapid. Alright, then they talk about tutorial levels. Obviously tutorials teach the player how to play. Some games have their own unique tutorial where it's like, okay, here's the game, do I want to start the tutorial first, and then that doesn't really affect the player. I just learned how to play the game. Other games, the tutorial is built into the first level or 2. So just remember in your tutorials, start with the very basic stuff and don't assume a player knows how to do everything. Remember, there are plenty of new people getting their first computer or their first PlayStation, things like that, and they're going to try your game. They may not know that the WASD keys do movement. They may be using the arrow keys. Ooh. But you get the idea. Alright, typically voiceover narration works best for tutorials. Hey, try the WASD keys. And then obviously you can always use text. Remember, voice files obviously are bigger than text files, so they will take up more space, and they do require more resource management on the PC or the console, whatever the player's using. And that's why a lot of these games we don't typically see voiceover narration. We just see text on the screen. Or if we do get voiceovers, it's very minor. Alright, and then they tell you, make sure that you make the tutorial levels optional. If you have a unique tutorial, don't make it required. There are a lot of people that just like to just jump into the game and learn it that way. I know when I play the Civilization games, I don't do the tutorial. I just jump in and see what's new and kind of figure it out myself. Alright, the design level process. First you want to kind of start with brainstorming. What features do I want in this level? What is this level trying to do? And then maybe I just sketch out like a rough overview of the map, of what I want on that level. And then I go into the planning phase. And the planning phase, that's where I actually put the detail in. What's it gonna look like? What are the challenges actually gonna be? How am I gonna code this? What are the sequence of events? What's gonna be the rewards? What's gonna be the challenges? What story part is gonna play? Then I go into prototyping. I construct temporary models of the landscape. And then after I have something that I can play, I jump in and I play it, and I see if it instills that emotional response I was looking for. If you go to some of these bigger companies, you'll find they work on the engine, and then like the player and the bad guys, everything are just like capsules, oblong kind of things, and that's how they actually play the game to make sure that it's fun. And they work on the fun part first, then they just throw in the new art. Alright, then I refine and lock down, make corrections based on feedback, review and correct, until the level is flawless, like that happens. And then I lock the level. I say no more changes to this level. And then I hand it off to the artist and say, hey, make these art assets to fill this up. So usually adding the art assets is almost always the last thing that you want to do in the game. Tell the artist, hey, this is what it should look like, and tell the audio team, hey, this is the feeling I'm trying to go for. All right, they mentioned art and rigging. Rigging is basically you've got a design of a person. You want to put like these fake bones inside the person and say these are the bend points and these are where it can move, and then you work on animation and things like that. You also want to have your art department, after you discuss, hey, this is what the character should look like, they should design, a picture for you to look at first before they actually start creating the game art. And then once you approve that art, then they can actually make the game art. Alright, then you kind of put everything together, you put the art assets in, and then you check things, make sure the animation between the players or whatever, anything that moves, you want to check the rigging. Make sure that the bend points are at the right places. Then you want to fix for bugs, and then you want to do testing and tuning, and then you're just about ready. So make sure the scope is right. Design within your available resources. If you're going to be an indie game designer, obviously you're not going to make a World of Warcraft, a Mass Effect, a Fallout 4. That's just not going to happen. What you're going to make is an Angry Birds type game with obviously a lot less graphic art style. Or you're going to make some other, like a Super Mario game or something like that. Your first game is typically you find something else out there and then you modify it. Like you might look at a first-person shooter that maybe that's freeware or something like that, and then you might decide to get that and then modify it. Modify the art assets, add some different levels and things like that, and then release it free as well. Or you may look at something else that's out there like Skyrim or Fallout 4, and you might design a mod for that that changes something. So remember, when you're first designing things, you're not shooting for the moon. Design something that's actually available to you, something that within your range, something that you can do. Almost all of the game designers out there today started by doing mods. Modding levels, modding different weapons, things like that. Making modifications to an existing product. And then that got them noticed, and then they got into Q&A where they were testing games and looking for bugs. Then they kind of worked their way up. But typically modifying some existing component is really the easiest way to kind of get into games or game design. Alright, then there's that $1,000 word again, conceptual non-sequiturs. That just means you don't want things that don't fall in order. If you and your friend are discussing something that's going on at work, and all of a sudden your friend just says, "Hey, I love cheese," that's an example of that. So you don't want weird, illogical things. Now, sometimes random events are hilarious. Like if you've ever played the Saints Row games, and you're robbing a bank or something, and all of a sudden a cop shows up and he's holding a big purple sex toy. You're like, what the fudge is that all about? So sometimes random can be funny, but as a general rule, unless you're going for funny, and that's part of your game, you don't want to have weird stuff like that. Like you don't want to be playing an alien shooter and all of a sudden have a dinosaur or a zombie show up, things like that. So remember, players should be rewarded, not punished for using their intelligence. So if they find creative ways to get around things, they should be rewarded. Alright, make atypical levels optional. And atypical levels break the player's suspension of belief. An atypical level could prevent some players from completing the game. So always make those optional. Alright, don't show the player everything at once. You want to introduce new features gradually. You want to maintain the player's interest. You want to give them something to shoot for. Like, oh, dude, I can't wait till I get to level 25 so I can actually use a mount. Things like that. But don't place them too far out there. Because sometimes it's like, all right, now I'm at level 15. This is boring as crap. I'm not doing another 10 levels of running all over the map just to get my, my motorized mount or whatever I'm going to ride. So I'm just going to quit the game. So think about it both ways. Alright, never lose sight of your audience. It's always a player-centric approach. Who's my target audience? What emotion do I want them to get? Who's my target audience? What emotion am I trying to get? Always thinking about the target audience and what they want. And then read the Bad Game Designer No Twinkie articles for more examples of design errors. Alright, and if you try to cut and paste that address in, you'll see this extra character that kind of pops up here between the slash and the no. You want to make sure you take that out. And see if it takes, now that'll take you to the right place. So if you do like me and you try to cut and paste that. So again, you can come here, you can check it out, hit No Twinkie 1. And you can get different information on things that kind of killed the game or that kind of stuff. Alright, and there's a whole bunch of stuff for each one. Where they talk about poor acting, stupid opponents, and the effect that it had on them. Alright, but you get the idea. So again, make sure if you cut and paste that, you look for that character that kind of pops up there. And then you have the summary. Hooray! Alright, so this week in Angel, you got the PowerPoints, and then there's that link to the Super Meat Boy level design, where they discuss level design using Super Meat Boy as an example. And then your projects or your assignments. No assignments this week. Keep working on project 2. Ray! So no extra assignments this week. Alright, that kind of wraps it up. Again, if you have any questions or whatever, let me know. And you're almost done. Just get that project done and submit it, and you're free. Yay! Alright, folks, have a good one.